Thanks also to the Linda Hall Library for the invitation to speak here today. And I've also been so grateful for the fellowship that the Linda Hall Library has granted me to do research in this wonderful and unique collection of materials in the history of technology. I'm working on the history of engineering, and it's in particular the unique holdings in the Linda Hall Library of certain engineering periodicals that make it so important and so special to me. These periodicals only exist in one other location in the United States, in Chicago. In the project that I'm working on, I look at how engineers first emerged as a social and professional group in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I also look at the increasing interest that some engineers had at the time in philosophy, in reading and writing philosophical texts. I look at Germany and the United States in particular. These two countries were, together with France, the leading places and nations of the so-called Second Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution had originated in Great Britain around 1780, and it had revolved around coal, iron ore, and the steam engine. The Second Industrial Revolution, around 1890, was different. It was about electricity, chemistry, steel and concrete, and the internal combustion engine. And historians of technology have emphasized how important it is to keep in mind that the technologies that were in use on the eve of the First World War in 1914 were completely different from those that had been in use around 1840. It was entirely new systems and a whole new experience of industrialization that people went through within barely 1.5 generations. And people at the time knew that and expressed it in technical ways, but also in political, cultural, and artistic ways. German and American engineers also engaged in a cross-Atlantic trade at the time. They exchanged with each other ideas about technology and society, about state building, and about abstract terms such as culture, history, civilization, and engineering. They had lots to talk about with each other and about each other, not least because these engineers' dialogues were a small part of a larger context of German and American commercial and intellectual exchange at the time. There was a rich and abundant set of stereotypes that each nation had developed about the other, and these stereotypes were used to make sense of this Atlantic axis and also of the place of one's own country in the history of the modern West in general. The main part of my talk today will deal with the German side of my project, and I use it to develop questions about the roles of philosophy and the social status of engineers in the heavily industrializing world and its crises between 1900 and 1933. Towards the end, I will present a few outlooks into the Atlantic space to indicate how all this connects to the US and to German-American relations at the time, but also later in the 20th century, when these relations were so crucial geographically, politically, and technologically for the unfolding and for the symbolic representation of the Cold War. Part of the idea of doing philosophy was for German engineers around 1900 an ambition that they had, and perhaps a necessity to constitute themselves as a new cultural and political elite. Philosophy was an instrument for them to secure upward social mobility in a society that was very rigid still at the time in Imperial Germany. Engineers were in fierce competition with existing entrenched elites, mostly from the military and from the nobility, but perhaps most importantly from the higher ranks of the bureaucracy of the civil servants in the German state. These people were humanistically trained. They studied philosophy and philology. They read Greek and Latin. They were trained in classical literary and musical canons. Some of them were theologians, many of them were lawyers. That was the spirit of education at the time in Germany and of political and cultural leadership. The spirit was based not least on a mix of conservative and romantic thinking, which had originated in the early 19th century and had positioned itself in opposition to the Enlightenment and also in opposition to the machine and factory culture of the early Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. The constitution of engineers as a social group began during the Industrial Revolution with the education of ordinary technicians at a range of schools. In Germany, several successful reforms happened between the 1850s and the 1870s, and these reforms turned basic technician schools into proper technical universities. This is just a list of these universities. So there's a technical university in Dresden, Karlsruhe, it's in South Germany, Aachen, it's near Cologne, Stuttgart, also in South Germany, Berlin, Zurich in Switzerland, and Braunschweig, that's in the land of Lower Saxony. And the first date here gives you the founding of the technician school, and the second date gives you the reform of a basic technician school into a proper technical university. These technical universities, as they were being founded or reformed in the 1870s, 1880s, were furnished with their own research laboratories, which were based in their ideas on the models of physics, chemistry, and physiology at the time. The new technical universities also received the right to confer advanced academic degrees. Just have a look at the architecture here. So upon the reform and the founding as a new technical university, there was new buildings that were necessary, and that gives you a sense of the ambition and the pride, this sort of historicist and neoclassicist architecture here. This is the Technical University in Aachen, in Zurich, pretty massive buildings here. Charlottenburg, that is in Berlin, also pretty massive building here. In Dresden, that was a little less ambitious, more modest. Stuttgart, also very similar architecture here. And Braunschweig, just again, a very ambitious and very proud tradition already of technical universities. Important engineering societies were also founded at the time. Civil engineering in 1871, miners in 1880, and electrical engineers in 1893. And these societies became effective mouthpieces for the social and for the technical agendas of engineers. The year 1899 was particularly successful once again for these technical universities because they received from the German Emperor Wilhelm II himself the right to grant PhD degrees in engineering. And in formal terms, this made them fully equal institutions of learning on par with traditional universities. That was a big deal for them because engineers continued to struggle for their place in the social order of the German Empire. They were frowned upon by the humanistically trained dignitaries as mere mechanics who were lacking education, culture, and lifestyle. Many engineering professions did, of course, have their roots in craft and artisan traditions, and engineers were keen to distinguish their emerging professional identity from lower status craft groups such as surveyors, carpenters, building contractors, or mechanics and machinists. There were also struggles among engineers between practically trained and academically trained engineers. They argued with each other about the emphasis on science, mathematics, and Latin in engineering education, precisely in these schools. These disputes were, of course, about methods and techniques in engineering education, but they were also, once again, about social status and about class. Among those who expressed most bluntly such hierarchies of people and knowledge in Germany were the so-called poet engineers. Poet engineers at the time popularized ideas about technology and about engineers. They thought of themselves as being a hinge between the technical and the humanistic elites in Germany, and they thought of themselves as being credible to both sides. Max Maria von Weber was the oldest son of the famous composer Carl Maria von Weber, who invented German romantic opera in the 19th century. And his son Max was a typical poet engineer around 1900. This is Max. So Max came from a quintessential cultured family, obviously, but he was also trained as an engineer at the recently founded Technical University at Dresden. These buildings. Max worked as a railway engine driver, and later in his life, he wrote literary texts and popular essays on technology and engineering. He specifically discussed the railway in popular magazines in 7 essays between 1875 and 1877. One of these essays was entitled "The Social Status of German Technicians in Political and Social Life." Die Stellung der deutschen Techniker im staatlichen und sozialen Leben. And this is what Max says about engineers. There are parvenus, and one of them is the estate of the engineers. The traditional estates somehow don't know how to integrate them into their ranks. Professors at universities consider them as interlopers, and for governments, they are an inconvenient new element in the mechanism of the state. Everyone feels bothered by their increasing relevance. Everyone calls them, at least deep down, a necessary evil. One of the many things that are conspicuous in this text is the use of the term estate. The term was used by engineers and by the humanistically educated dignitaries in Germany until way into the 20th century, in fact, all the way to this day. Even though the term estate actually describes the social order in Europe in the Middle Ages, way before industrialization. A long-lasting pattern of dividing labor and professions had emerged in the feudal system in Europe in the High Middle Ages. A division into land-owning nobility, privileged knights, dependent peasants, clergy, and merchants. And church laws and secular laws made these divisions very stable over centuries, and they gave rise to solid rules of conduct, codes of honor, marriage and dress conventions, and laws for property ownership. A person's actual socio-economic status was as important as normally his, symbolically communicated place in the social hierarchy, which was expressed once again through dress code, eating habits, or marriage behavior. This symbolically communicated social status was also often captured in terms of honor. And honor was once again a term that engineers and dignitaries used until way into the 20th century. So these groups with different legal status and codes of conduct in the European medieval world were called estates. And as a memory and as a rhetorical and ideological tool, this estate tradition remained alive and powerful for the formation of modern professional identities until way into the industrial and post-industrial worlds. Many of the actual laws of the estate society were still valid and operating even after the First World War in Germany and France. And it was not least the humanistically trained German dignitaries with whom engineers were competing who claimed for themselves a rightful place in the time-honored tradition of the estate society. They used this to distinguish themselves from the new industrial order and the new mass society and from the engineers. So words like Max Maria von Weber's and this history tell us how precarious and how uncertain the situation was of engineers around 1900, economically, but also culturally and ideologically. What confounded the situation even more was the engineers' own ambivalent relationship to this estate ethos of the educated civil servants of the German state. Many engineers readily appropriated the role model of the cultured middle-class male as their own, but not all of them did. As a consequence of that, some historians have blamed the dilemma of the engineers' social status on them, and they have described it as a failure on the engineers' part to adopt a coherent and stable professional identity. And indeed, the increasing institutionalization and professionalization of engineers and the incorporation of engineers into organizations went hand in hand with internal conflicts and fragmentation. There continued to be a variety of qualifications and degrees, no uniform criteria for professionalization, and a lack of autonomy in professional activity, in particular when it was compared to scientists, physicians, and lawyers. One historian draws a particularly negative balance for engineers' efforts to professionalize between the 1850s and the 19-teens. He states that in 1914, German engineers had achieved only modest gains in their pursuit of professional standing, and that on the cusp of World War I, they were further away from their goal than they had been 30 or 40 years earlier. Historians and myself have been interested in the effect that this marginalization may have had on engineers in the period between the Second Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the Nazi regime. There's nothing straightforward about the status of these engineers as a social group, about their legally constituted associations, and also, that's my interest, they as individuals who practice philosophy. Both engineers and philosophers at the time were engaged in developing new types of philosophies of technology. The audience of engineers' philosophical writings were primarily other engineers, and the medium of communication was the professional societies of engineers and the periodicals that were attached to them. And this is where the Linda Hall Library becomes important for me and its holdings. Particularly important in this regard for me is the association of German engineers with university degrees, the Verband Deutscher Diplom-Ingenieure. This association of German engineers with university degrees was founded in 1909 explicitly as an elite society, exclusively for engineers with advanced university degrees, and as a reaction to the class struggles among engineers that I just talked about. There had been efforts to exclude non-academic engineers, those without university degrees, such as mechanics or technicians with apprenticeship certificates or master mechanics. So there had been efforts to exclude them from the larger generic association of German engineers. So this is the larger association of German engineers, and that had already been founded in 1856, very early in the Second Industrial Revolution. But the efforts to exclude non-academic engineers from this generic association had failed. That was in 1908. And as a consequence, a part of this generic association broke off and founded a more elite association, an association for German engineers with university degrees. And the engineers that were organized in this elite association were particularly keen to establish that technology was as crucial a part of German cultural identity as the work of the humanistically trained dignitaries. This is an ongoing concern in this periodical that I've been reading here at the Linda Hall Library, was first issued in 1909. Just a few pictures to give you a sense of the way that it was designed. So this is a bit of an Art Nouveau kind of design here that is from 1912, one of the earliest issues. The later one is renamed into Technology and Culture in 1921. They also then had a new editor named Karl Weyer. I'll talk about him in a little while. And here you can see more obsession with culture. This is already in 1934, was after the beginning of the Nazi regime. The entire journal from 1909 until 1937, when the association was ended, is here actually at the Linda Hall Library, and as I said, is only in one other place in the United States in its entirety, and that is in Chicago. Among the engineers that were involved with this periodical and with philosophy, I'm most interested in those who actively forged connections to radically conservative and nationalist German philosophers at the time and into the 1930s. The roots of German conservatism went all the way back to the reaction to the French Revolution. But later in the 19th century, the German conservative movement became more of a tradition of militaristic and dictatorial nationalism. It rejected various principles of modern politics and culture, such as individualism, rationalism, parliamentarism, industrialism, or the rule of the law. And also such conservative and nationalist radicalizing philosophers played a crucial role in the notorious political tensions that were so typical and so destructive for the Weimar Republic. It is of course difficult to unify this nationalist philosophical movement of the time under one umbrella, but for part of it one can say that it made up the most important intellectual movement in Germany during the first 3 decades of the 20th century that opposed the ideas of democratic parliamentary forms of government and the Republican state form. The historian Jeffrey Herf, he teaches at the University of Maryland, has written what might be the groundbreaking work of this complex of ideologies and social groups at the time. And he also singles out this elite association of engineers with university degrees and their journal as a platform for engineers and philosophers who try to develop philosophies of technology. Each issue typically had an essay on Friedrich Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, or Oswald Spengler, as well as commentary on recent technical systems or artifacts, such as train stations or airplanes. As I said, a man named Karl Weyer edited the journal from 1921, there he is, the editor, edited the journal from 1921 to 1934. And his aim was explicitly to make philosophical writings accessible to engineers and to create an intellectual but also a nationalist tradition among them. Some historians are a little dismissive here, and they complain that the rationality of engineers' professional practice should have prevented them from becoming receptive to the often mythical, irrationalist, or anti-democratic ideologies from the 1920s. But such complaints do not bring out in any more clarity the historical realities of German engineers in this period, and they do not bring out in any more clarity the profound tensions and disagreements that were underlying Germany's first attempts at developing a democratic culture in the Weimar Republic. I tried to apply as broad as possible an idea of practice to engineers' engagement with philosophy, an idea of practices of reading and writing philosophy and of social upward mobility. And I look now at a couple of texts in this periodical of this elite association of engineers with a university degree to see what we can make of the relationship at this time between engineers and engineering, philosophy, technology, and social order. Then I'll look at a few more individuals, philosophers as well as industrialists, to get a sense of what kind of people clustered around this journal. Karl Weyhe, who edited the journal from 1921 onwards, he already wrote an article in 1911 for the periodical, and it was entitled Affinities in the Ways of Thinking Between Engineers and Arthur Schopenhauer. Verwandtschaftliches in der Denkweise des Ingenieurs und Arthur Schopenhauers. In this essay, Weyhe says at the outset that some people will be surprised to hear the name Schopenhauer in connection with the profession of the engineer, the most modern of modern professions, which has assigned itself the task of producing commodities and thus satisfying people's ever-increasing needs. Weyhe reminds the reader that the science of engineering builds on the natural sciences, which do not believe in metaphysics, as he says. How strange, therefore, he says, must a philosopher such as Schopenhauer seem to physics. Schopenhauer, who not only pursues metaphysics, but claims a fundamental need of man for metaphysical thinking. Still, Weyhe holds that he can demonstrate that Schopenhauer's unique ways of thinking displays affinities to ways of thinking of the engineer. This makes studying Schopenhauer attractive to any engineer, Weyhe says. What matters to Weyhe in Schopenhauer's work is the high valuation of reality, the sharp observation of detail from intuition and visual impression, the German term is Anschauung, and the emphasis on the visual, the intuitive, the immediate, and the concrete, again, das Anschauliche, as opposed to abstract terminology. This is what makes Schopenhauer's thinking relevant for engineers, Weyhe says. He quotes Schopenhauer as saying, and this is Schopenhauer, "My sentences are not based on reasoning, but immediately on the visual world itself," end of quote. And a bit later, Weyhe quotes Schopenhauer again, "The real inner core of any knowledge is an intuition," end of quote. Schopenhauer puts less value on mere abstract thinking, Weyhe says, and Weyhe traces how Schopenhauer criticizes philosophers who use reflection but not intuition. Weyhe actually celebrates and admires in this text the life, he says, and the intense reality that is gushing from Schopenhauer's words. It is indeed, Weyhe says, the visual image that is the basis of the engineer's daily work, building machines, drawing, imagining. Engineers' work relies on metaphors, he says, and there is an innate sense of reality in the engineer. And, he says, Schopenhauer, like the engineer, uses examples that are drawn from everyday life, unlike the abstract bureaucrat or the abstract philosopher. The abstract philosopher, the abstract bureaucrat, or the judge, these are men whom Weyhe dismisses as unworldly and wimpy. And Weyhe laments the absence of imaginative thinking, thinking with images and concrete things in the administration of the state as well as in jurisprudence. Without this thinking, without this concrete thinking, he says, modern culture and its complexity and its industry and its technology cannot be understood. Abstract thinking that only operates with words rather than images is not sufficient for the modern technological world, he says. This is not, he says, a struggle between two professions. And I actually think that's a way of saying that it is. Instead, Weyhe claims emphasis on thinking with images and concrete things is a necessity by the law of nature. So Weyhe's effort to pursue philosophy, to make philosophy accessible to engineers, and to perform philosophy for engineers played out in such articles in this magazine. And you see in the same picture here some engineering details here in the upper half. These details, they deal with mass, cogs, gear transmission here, forces, velocity, and problems of voltage. And this proximity of engineering issues and philosophy issues, very typical for this periodical, and you find it throughout, from 1909 all the way into the 1930s. 3 more pictures about this proximity. This is the demonstration, an article about one of the big pumps that was actually important in the construction of, in the production of steel. And then you see advertisement for railways, for example, or other issues of heavy industry and heavy industrialism. Another example, so these would be ads that you would see in every issue. There will be issues either once or twice a month. Other examples for the philosophy of technology. This is literally about the philosophy of technology, and you see important, so Wilhelm Wundt over here, the usual suspects of names at the time. You see Schopenhauer down here again, Nietzsche, Spinoza, and then there is Schopenhauer here once again. Up there's an emphasis on art, and here again on technology. Besides these ads and this kind of philosophizing, the Association of German Engineers with University Degrees also had to branch out after it was founded, and it had to create for itself an audience, influence, and financial resources. A group of engineers, philosophers, professors, and wealthy factory owners ended up clustering at the time around this journal and questions of technology and society, nationalism and conservatism, and philosophical writing that was disseminated in this journal. One example is the engineering professor Carl Julius von Bach. That is him. He taught at the Technical University of Stuttgart, this one from 1878 until 1922. That was a long career. He was a pioneer in the theoretical foundations of material science, but he was also involved heavily in the social question at the time of the struggle between capital-owning classes and working classes. He became famous in particular through a widely received essay competition that he organized in 1913 through the large Generic Association of German Engineers. The essay question was, how can we attenuate the antagonism between the classes in Germany? This is the corresponding newspaper article, Milderung der Klassengegensätze. That was how he called it. And the elite association of engineers with university degrees, they approached him soon after their founding in 1909 with a letter, and they said, "Dear professor, can you please join us and pay member dues? We can also offer you an advanced and privileged membership status that comes with a higher fee." It's these kind of people that they approached, the Association of German Engineers with a university degree. Another example of a much wealthier man is Paul Reusch. That is him, an industrialist. He emerged in the end in the 1920s as one of the economically most successful and politically most influential men at the time. He had studied mining engineering in the 1880s and became the director of one of the biggest mining and machine building corporate groups in Germany at the time, the Guterhofner. That is the Guterhofner in 1920. Another image, later in the 1920s, more corporations would join them. This is actually the Guterhofner in the 1950s. That is when it had its largest expansion. My students call this the technological sublime when I show them this image. And this is a map, so this would all be in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, the big coal and steel area of the Second Industrial Revolution. Reusch also became a supporter of the radical conservative and nationalist movements after the First World War, and he rejected the democratic system in favor of more authoritarian ways of governing the state. Since I'm interested in the overlap of people, philosophy, money, and institutions at the time, one of the most interesting things about him, for me, is the long-lasting friendship that he had with the philosopher Oswald Spengler. Spengler became very prominent in Europe as well as in North America with the publication of his 2-volume book, The Decline of the West, in 1918. This is the German version. One of the things that occupied him at the time, the theoretical ideas, was what was called at the time the cultural morphology. Cultural morphology of world history, and that is also the subtitle of his book, right here. Oops. So these are the contours of a morphology of world history. This is the English translation. Unfortunately, in the subtitle of the book, the cultural morphology was dropped. But the concept of morphology of world history included for Spengler a number of claims about what constitutes history, the course that history takes, theories of life, culture, and civilization, and theories of technology and of the sciences. Spengler always demarcated himself from institutionally attached scholars, and he celebrated his own free intellectual and poetic activity, while he was at the same time suffering deeply from feelings of isolation and loneliness. His intellectual activity, it was about existential philosophy, it was about theories of history, it was also about evolutionary theory. It was never meant to be a systematic philosophical activity in a specific discipline, let alone based on empiricist or inductive methods. He always insisted on an intuitive, poetic approach to the world. A book by him on Prussia and socialism from 1919 is widely considered to be the founding piece of the conservative movement of the Weimar Republic, partly because it was the first publication that was directed against the Weimar Republic, which had just been founded a year earlier. Spengler's work also figured prominently in the periodical of the elite association of German engineers with university degrees. The engineers were particularly interested in Spengler's ideas about history, culture, mathematics, and what he called the machine. Now, Spengler and Paul Reusch, they met in the early 1920s. At the time, Spengler was a regular guest in the nationalist conservative circles of industrialists, factory owners, and wealthy families in the Ruhr Valley in industrial Germany. This is Spengler, sorry. These are the kind of houses that people like Paul Reusch would live in. Another one of these mansions. He had 5 or 6 of those mansions right around his corporations. People lived in there, often on the edge of their large industrial corporations, but this is also where they socialized with each other. And with philosophers. Spengler himself resided in Munich, where he was living off a small inheritance from his mother. Reusch kept inviting Spengler for talks. He supported to come to the Ruhr Valley. He supported him financially. Some of his often obscure radical academic projects. Reusch also asked Spengler to buy art and paintings for him at auctions to furnish his prestigious houses and mansions. And Reusch also gave Spengler a loan for buying himself a fairly chic house in Munich. I just want to show you some of that correspondence here. So this is where he says, where Reusch says, "Dear Mr. Spengler, could you please come and speak in our Montag Society and give a talk here?" One of the many occasions, Spengler says, "Sure, I'm coming, and what I'm going to talk about is Schiller and the political drama." Those were the kind of topics that the industrialists were interested in. Oh, then he says, Spengler says to Reusch, "Hey, I saw this house. I was about to leave town, and I saw this very nice house. It's kind of ducal, has 8 rooms, solid. Can you give me a loan for the down payment? Yeah, and please, only if it is no trouble for you." This means no trouble. And please, if you want to do this, you can give the money to this person who works for my publisher. This is the other way around, where Spengler says, "Yes, I went to this auction and I bought these paintings for you." So this is again, so Reusch had other people who did all the art and culture stuff for him. This just says, yes, I'm definitely coming in early April. I think there's one more where Reusch says to Spengler, "Hey, I'm coming to Munich. You want to have dinner with me at 8 in the Regina Hotel? Please come in black tie." So, this is definitely, once again, about class, in this case about industrialists and philosophers. These connections between philosophy and industrial capitalism were not unusual at the time, and what they did in regard to my questions, they spread ideas about the nascent philosophies of technology at the time among philosophers, industrialists, but also among engineers. The Atlantic space now, North America and the New World, they add another set of questions to this history, and they sharpen some of the historical problems about the role of philosophy and engineering, engineers' class conflicts, and questions about the role of technology in society. The efforts of German and American engineers to find their place in their respective societies happened against the background of two very different histories of these two countries. Different histories of industrialization, of engineering education, and of nation-state building. The separate histories have been well researched in connection with themes such as technology transfer, business cooperation, and shared standards in safety and education. What I'm interested in is how German and American engineers traded with each other ideas and support specifically in regard to what I've outlined here, and how they turned in this way the Atlantic into an exchange space for social and philosophical engineering concerns. Engineers in the US also struggled with questions of class and with building a coherent professional identity, in particular vis-à-vis the standard role models that they had in their heads of doctors and lawyers and the high social status that these had in American society. Historians have pointed out repeatedly that the role of engineers in the development of modern America is paradoxical. Engineers played a major role in designing, building, and managing the material and economic infrastructure of the United States in regard to transportation, city building, machines and machine tools, power transmission, and communication. But often engineers seem to have limited control of and visibility in their work. Some people have emphasized in regard to this paradox that Americans often see themselves primarily as a democratic people, dedicated to the doctrine of free enterprise and business. They rarely think of themselves as builders, as a people whose most notable achievement for the last 3 centuries has been to transform a wilderness into a building site. The distinguished historian of technology, Thomas Hughes, he actually says that. He wrote a Pulitzer Prize-nominated book, American Genesis, and in this book he says the following. A nation of builders, he means the US, does not know itself. Most of the history it reads and hears instructs otherwise, end of quote. This is from page 1 of American Genesis. Engineering in the US was in the 19th century an individualistic profession, dominated by independent consultants and shop owners. And around 1900, this began to change because of the growing scale of corporate organization and the increasing complexity of technology. Salaried engineers working for corporations now were taking center stage. In Europe, the state had been the primary patron of engineering and education throughout the 19th century, notably in France. And while American engineering emulated parts of the French model through its military academies in West Point and Annapolis, the main differences in the organization of the American engineering profession, both vis-à-vis France and vis-à-vis Germany, lay in the difference of understandings of the role of the state and of the government. The first American civilian engineering education programs emerged in separate technical institutes at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Worcester Institute of Technology, and MIT. And that was because American higher education was initially dominated by colleges that emphasized the classics, theology, literature, and pure science. And that was again a German model that had been adopted by Americans in the 19th century, an influential model that Wilhelm von Humboldt and others had developed in the early 19th century from Renaissance humanism. In regard to this Atlantic space, I'm learning at the moment most from the dynamics of 3 historical processes. Immigration, either permanent or temporary, between Germany and the US. It was not quite even, but there was a rich history in both directions. Associations of German and American engineers, mostly in the US, and government or private-sponsored research trips by American engineers to Germany and German engineers to the US. In regard specifically to the philosophy of technology and larger ideas of technology in society, I learned a lot from engineers in German-American engineering societies who discussed here in the US in monthly meetings the virtues and vices of their respective nation-states and the political and social security systems. And this is again where the Linda Hall Library and its wonderful collections come in for me. Just one more example of this. Those are the proceedings of the German-American Association of Technicians, or actually there is the International Association of German-American Technologists. This was issued in Philadelphia, and there was clubs, caucuses in Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Boston, and New York City as well. So just one more example of what these articles would be about. So this would be dirigible airships, for example, right here, about aviation. They had either monthly or even weekly meetings where people would present, but also philosophy. So this is about Philadelphia, this is about an excursion to Egg Harbor in New Jersey, but there is also another presentation on Friedrich Nietzsche. So these philosophical topics, either on theories of life or on theories of technology, continue to be important. I also learn about the exchange of ideas and personnel across the Atlantic in the context of the American technocracy movement that was founded by Howard Scott. That was a genuinely American effort that started in the 19-teens, just before the First World War. But this technocracy movement in the US was also supported by emigre German and Austrian engineers who ended up teaching engineering as professors at Union College and at Columbia University. And I also finally learned from the transportation and translation of ideas from Germany to the US, ideas about history and society, like ideas by Oswald Spengler, but also Max Weber and Karl Marx, and finally by Werner Sombart, who was actually the founder of the discipline of sociology in Germany. So the very founding of the disciplines of sociology, social theory, economics, and the history of technology coincided in this period with my concerns. And ideas about the nature and the threats of modern industrial capitalism, about the appropriateness of technologies vis-à-vis human values, and about whether technological change determines social change. Those ideas and questions took some of their roots in this German-American Atlantic exchange. And they then survived, as you probably know, way into the 20th century, into the American counterculture movement, for example. And yet, for the American and German engineers who were participating in the building of industrial and economic empires around 1900, for them, industrialization was still a fairly new thing. There were no existing models that could help them integrate their machine cultures and systems into existing theories and practices of modern culture. And even though there's a wide agreement nowadays that it is, among other things, the industrial capitalism that makes modern societies modern, this question and the phenomena coming with it was something that engineers around 1900 were facing for the first time. Thank you.
Raise your hand. I'll come by with the microphone for questions.
What was the impact of the Bauhaus in the mid-1920s?
It was huge. So the Bauhaus was something that mobilized lots of energy, intellectual energy, but also financial energy among artists and engineers and industrialists, and also attracted the attention of American scholars and American architects who then translated these ideas across the Atlantic once again. The reason I didn't bring it up here so much, one of the biggest connections for me would be ideas about housing for workers, for example, the social ideas about how to make this industrial production livable for the people who are involved in it. But a lot of the Bauhaus discussion was about aesthetics and architecture and about art. And this was something that the philosophers that I'm looking at were not so interested in. So yes, it was very much influenced by that. It was a very well-known name and a very well-known movement. And as I said, it spawned a lot of energy, intellectual energy. But it's people that seem to be operating that I am looking at, they seem to be interested in a slightly different set of themes and questions. But it's exactly on the spot. This is where the Bauhaus belongs.
Thank you. Oops. I'm wondering, I was very intrigued by the notion of the poet-engineer. And so I'm sort of curious about the kinds of things that maybe they were writing or the ways in which they were trying to integrate the two different cultures. So I was wondering maybe you could
Okay, there's a whole other periodical culture that comes with it. You may have seen that was only one issue of several issues about the railway. And he would talk about, so this gets into this Max von Weber. He had this very good reputation of taking good care, a very paternalistic kind of thing, taking very good care of his workers, who were railway engineers or even in lower level workers. So he would talk about their lives at home as well as at work. He would come up with travel logs, how he would travel on the railway. He would write a railway poetry or travel poetry And there was another one called Max Eid. He came from the same area in South Germany. He was even more interested in novels that revolved around technology. So there's a lot of work that is now out of print, but that is preserved in certain archives. And the credit that they received, maybe even independent of what they actually ended up doing, from both sides, from the humanistically trained dignitaries, as well as from the engineers, is the engineers in particular, they say you make technology comprehensible for non-technically trained people. And this is so important because we are so neglected and marginalized. I mean, that was this whole engineers thing. We don't have a saying in the cultural and political elite. It seems to, even though Germany was this heavily industrializing place, the actual discourse about what Germany should be seemed to be entirely separated from any industrial culture. And actually, I believe them. I'm with the engineers on that one. The discourse did not rely on Germany's industrial culture. That changed a little bit with the First World War, but before that, it was a seemingly neo-humanist Renaissance kind of culture because it came out of this Humboldtian neo-humanism. I want to say one more thing. I just want to say one more thing because I think it's so ironic and so symptomatic. When you go to the German Literature Archive in Marbach, and you're interested in poet engineers, when you speak with the people who are in charge of the fundraising, they exploit that same tradition of German engineering and German poetry and how they come together in these engineers. So could please the South German wealthy industrialists donate money to make these collections available? So I think the supposed convergence of German mastery, say of language and of aesthetics and of technology, they come here together and then they spawn institutions in exactly that way.
The word philosophy has different meanings, and it seems to me that one meaning would be the philosophy of engineering development, the techniques or the approaches that are used to create new technology. The other one is the philosophy of humanity, the poetry and ethics and so on. Are both meant in the intention of your work?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder to use the term philosophy, even the philosophy of technology, even though people at the time use the term themselves for often very different things, as you pointed out, theories of life, theories of civilization, or even just a downright epistemology of engineering knowledge. How is engineering knowledge different from physicists' knowledge, which would often be translated back into the social status. So for the moment, I am fairly content with calling philosophy whatever abstract or theoretical question, either about life, about civilization, about culture, or indeed about technology and its impact, as it were, on society. But it gets increasingly difficult. Sometimes it gets easier again, and there will be a point, I think, when I'll have to make some kind of differentiation, because that brings me to one slightly different problem. People have asked me if I follow the engineers to learn about philosophy, the articles in this periodical, and the answer to that question I think is probably no, which is a bit of a problem. I have to understand very well how I want to read these philosophical texts. They are often not particularly good interpretations of Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, and yet I find the effort so important. And the idea is that these engineers attach to their own idea of what philosophy is. So even if it will be questionable, and if I discuss with my philosophy colleagues, is this philosophy or not, which I think is a valid question, as a social historian, I say these are real people, they work in institutions, and they believed they were doing philosophy. And this is something that is important in all kinds of ways, not least politically, because it happened that these philosophical reflections made a number of these engineers move further and further to the right on the political spectrum in the 1920s. And as many people have said that before, but they are among the professions that people have discussed this, are they among the professions with judges, physicians, pastors, who have provided the ideological grounds for National Socialism in the late 20s. So thanks for bringing that up. So I'm not very rigorous at the moment, because I don't think I would gain anything by saying that they're not pursuing real philosophy. But some people would say that's not real philosophy, so we don't have to look at it as philosophical pieces of work.
Any more questions?
Yes, what would you say that the impact of wealth, or that as the philosophers, they're building philosophy in? Are they doing that after they're already established and that engineering and industry has made their group wealthy, or is it pre or post the wealth aspect?
That's another good question. Thank you for that. I can only look at a number of individuals, and I'm not sure if there's a pattern emerging. That's why I brought up these most important individuals. Spengler, some people call him very prominent, but until his mother died, he was dead poor. He could not even pass the exam for becoming a teacher in the land of Lower Saxony. So had to, as long as mother, whom he hated, he had to go back to her and beg her for money. So she finally died, could live off that. And then he was done with that inheritance, and then Paul Reusch came along. So there's a lot of precariousness, but that was shared among many people. Not least, I'm just actually happened to look at Rudolf Diesel's family, the diesel engine inventor. He committed suicide on a ship on the Channel between England and Belgium, I think. Left his family dead poor. So all kinds of families who were rich in the 1890s were dead poor in 1918. Maybe rich again in the 1920s, and the 1930s came along. So this kind of up and down, it was an economically extremely intense, but also in regard to class, extremely intense time. So I would say that there was always ideas. It was a perfectly normal thing at the time to come up with large theories of civilization and where the German nation state belongs in world civilization. Many people engaged in that, in clubs, men in clubs. They either would have enough money to be in the club, or they would look for money to keep their club going, just like the engineers with the advanced degrees. So I would say it's a huge back and forth between ideas, nation-state building, and this precarious economic situation, including the big war right in the middle. Did that respond?
Thank you, Dr. Voskuhl, for a wonderful lecture.